Good evening, traveler. Tonight I invite you to step back in time, into a world of splendor, superstition, and spectacular mistakes. A world where one person's foolishness could change an entire kingdom's customs, or even reshape the beliefs of a continent. Before we settle into this journey together, take a moment to steady yourself. Let the room dim just a little. Let the quiet hum of night set in, and prepare to hear the kinds of tales history books often leave out. Because tonight we begin with stories from the medieval world, not about grand battles or sweeping empires, but about the little accidents, the private vanities, and the personal disasters that somehow ruined things for everyone else. Centuries ago, tournaments were the beating heart of medieval celebration. You could compare them to the dangerous thrill of modern racetracks. There were horses thundering across the fields, knights charging at one another in dazzling armor, and crowds eager for both glory and the chance of witnessing something dramatic, perhaps even fatal. The clashing of lances wasn't just sport, it was public theater laced with a scent of danger. At the height of this tradition stood King Henry II of France, bold, athletic, and, let's be honest, reckless. In the year 1559, he made a decision that would echo through time. He chose to mark his daughter's wedding not with a feast or proclamation, but with one final joust. It was to be a gesture of royal power and masculine grace. He'd done it before, after all. What harm could another tilt possibly bring? Everyone warned him not to. Physicians begged him to reconsider. His queen pleaded with him. Even the famed seer Nostradamus had penned a prophecy that spoke clearly of a splinter striking through the eye of a king. But Henry, proud and defiant, dismissed it all as nonsense. What was prophecy, after all, compared to honor? And so the joust began. His opponent was none other than Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his guard, a man whose life's duty was to protect the king, not to aim a sharpened weapon at his face. Yet on that day, honor demanded spectacle, and spectacle demanded risk. Their horses charged. The first pass came and went without issue. The second, likewise. Then came the third. In the blur of movement and thunder of hooves, Montgomery's lance shattered on Henry's helmet. A sliver of wood, sharp and swift, found the narrow gap between steel and skin. It pierced deep into the king's eye. The crowd fell silent, gasps, panic, confusion. Henry tried to stand, tried to brush it off as a scratch, but the truth was immediate and grim. For 10 agonizing days, his physicians tried everything: leeches, salves, desperate prayers. Nothing worked. The king slipped into death in unspeakable pain. The result? Jousting, once the noble sport of Europe, was suddenly viewed as barbaric. France outlawed it almost immediately. Other nations followed. The clatter of armor and the roar of tournaments faded from history, not because of war, but because one man, driven by pride, could not resist one last show. And just like that, one royal misjudgment changed the course of tradition forever. In the quiet corners of medieval monasteries, where prayer echoed through stone halls and silence was considered a virtue, not even the walls of faith could keep out the peculiar vanity of the human spirit. And no one proved that better than Brother Pierre. He was a young monk, newly entered into a Benedictine order somewhere in the hills of France. The kind of place where the day's most exciting event might be the copying of a particularly long manuscript. Life was supposed to be simple. Rise before dawn, pray, study, and renounce all forms of vanity. That was the theory. But Pierre had a flaw: his beauty, or rather, his obsession with it. Now, in those days, monks weren't supposed to look at themselves much, let alone admire what they saw. Mirrors were rare, often discouraged, and when they did appear, they were nothing more than polished metal, just enough to show whether you'd missed a spot shaving, or perhaps whether your tonsure was uneven. But somehow, Pierre had acquired one, and each night, long after the other monks had retired, He would sneak into the washroom, hold up the mirror in the candlelight, and gaze at his reflection. He adjusted his robe, ran fingers through his cropped hair, tilted his chin ever so slightly to one side. He wasn't just admiring himself. He was rehearsing, a pious pose here, a holy expression there, like a man practicing sainthood in a mirror. But then came the night when his little ritual turned disastrous. Pierre had set the mirror just right. The candle was lit, flickering gently beside a bed of hay. He leaned closer, admiring a profile that, in his mind, must have rivaled the archangel's. But in a moment of clumsy pride, his sleeve brushed the candle, knocking it to the floor. Flame met straw, straw met centuries-old wood. Within moments, the monastery was on fire. Smoke poured through the halls. Bells rang. Monks scrambled half-dressed through corridors, clutching books and relics. And there was Pierre, barefoot, soot-covered, running through the chaos, still clutching the mirror to his chest as though it might grant him salvation. By morning, half the monastery had been reduced to ash. The abbot, drenched in smoke and fury, made his ruling swiftly. Mirrors, he declared, were instruments of vanity and pride. From that day forward, they were forbidden, not just in their monastery, but soon in others across the land. For decades after, monks learned to shave by touch, dress by guesswork, and confess sins related to cheekbones. As the ban spread, some even claimed that mirrors were tools of the devil, reflective portals that tempted the soul toward sin. In truth, it wasn't about demons. It was about discipline and fire safety, all because one handsome monk couldn't look away. In the world of medieval nobility, falconry was more than a hobby. It was a performance of status. A nobleman might own a castle and a lineage stretching back generations, but without a bird perched on his wrist, he was simply incomplete. Falcons soared through the sky with elegance, hunting on command, their movements a statement of wealth and refined masculinity. But not everyone was content to follow the rules of tradition. Enter Lord Geoffrey of Kent. A man of ambition, yes, but more notably, a man utterly convinced of his own genius. Geoffrey looked at falcons and saw boredom. Everyone had them. They were predictable. He wanted something more impressive, something that would make every eye in the court turn his way. So he made a decision that would forever mark him as the oddest figure in falconry's history. He chose to train an owl. Now owls, for all their wisdom in fables, are not creatures suited for sport. They are solitary hunters of the night, silent, introverted, and deeply uninterested in human applause. But Lord Geoffrey, who mistook stubbornness for insight, declared that his owl, named Beatrice, would become the future of noble hunting. He fed her delicacies, commissioned a leather hood embroidered with gold thread, and trained with what he called unorthodox patience. When others laughed, he doubled down. This owl, he insisted, would eclipse all falcons in grace, intelligence, and obedience. The moment of truth came during a grand hunt hosted by royalty. Nobles gathered in a sunlit field with wine in hand, and falcons perched beside them, waiting for the show. And there stood Geoffrey, cloaked in velvet, Beatrice balanced on his arm like a sleepy prophet. The trumpets sounded. Geoffrey raised his arm dramatically. The crowd watched. Beatrice blinked. Nothing happened. She remained still, blinking again, and turned her head away from the sunlight like someone annoyed to be awake. Geoffrey, determined not to be embarrassed, flapped his arm with more urgency, shouted her name, and finally startled her into flight. Beatrice took off, not toward a rabbit or the sky, but directly at the royal chaplain. In an instant, the owl became a flurry of feathers and fury, clawing at the chaplain's head, shrieking like a banshee. Horses reared, nobles dropped goblets. Someone yelled about sorcery. The hunting party dissolved into chaos, with Beatrice clinging to the chaplain's robe as he screamed for divine protection. The king's horse bolted. Swords were drawn. And in the midst of it all, Geoffrey stood frozen, realizing that his great innovation had just assaulted a man of the cloth. It didn't take long for the consequences to arrive. The Royal Council issued a decree banning owls from all royal hunts, tournaments, and noble gatherings. They were declared unsuitable for sport, unstable, and, some whispered, possibly cursed. Owls, once admired for their mysterious silence, became symbols of disorder, all thanks to one man who wanted to be different. And somewhere, deep in the forest, Beatrice likely returned to her tree, unimpressed, unbothered, and entirely unaware that she had just ended an era. Medieval Europe was not known for its fashion sense. Most commoners owned a single outfit, bathed seasonally, and hoped simply not to die of disease. But among the nobility, one strange item became the pinnacle of style. A pair of shoes so outrageous, they quite literally brought men to their knees. They were called crackles, or pulanes, named after their supposed Polish origins. These shoes had absurdly long pointed toes that curled upwards, sometimes so dramatically that wearers had to tie the tips to their knees with little chains just to walk. To some, they were statements of status. To others, walking hazards in disguise. Sir Reginald of Essex, a nobleman whose vanity was as long as his shoes, took this fashion to extremes. While others boasted modest 6-inch tips, he commissioned a custom pair nearly 2 feet long. Crafted from fine Italian leather, stitched with gold thread, and finished with tiny silver bells that jingled with every step, they were a work of arrogance disguised as art. On a Sunday morning, Reginald decided to debut his masterpiece. At church of all places, he strutted into mass like a knight parading through a tournament, his shoes tapping against the marble floor, the bells announcing his presence with every stride. He made it down the aisle with only minor trouble, but as the choir began their hymn, disaster struck. One of his extravagant points snagged on the hem of a tapestry hanging near the altar. What followed was a spectacle more theatrical than any sermon. Reginald stumbled, then tumbled, arms flailing, and collided full force with the bishop. 2 altar boys went down like bowling pins. A candelabrum crashed to the floor. Wax splattered. The bishop, now singed and scandalized, screamed in indignation. Silence followed, broken only by the jingling of Reginald's shoes. The next day, the church passed a ban. Crackles were declared indecent, distracting, and prideful. Within weeks, their popularity plummeted. Preachers condemned them from pulpits, claiming the devil himself wore shoes like these. Artists began painting demons with long, pointed footwear as symbols of spiritual corruption. Reginald tried to defend himself. He claimed it was an accident, nothing more than poor balance. But the clergy had already decided pride had tripped not only the man, but the entire congregation. And so, shoes became sin. Fashion fell to modesty. And long before catwalks and paparazzi, one man managed to cancel footwear by crashing into a bishop. In the sacred world of medieval Europe, there was a strange day when reverence gave way to ridicule, a day when priests danced, monks cracked jokes, and the holy halls of cathedrals echoed not with chants, but with laughter. It was called the Feast of Fools. Originally, it was meant as a moment of humility, a reminder that even the most pious were still human, still prone to pride and folly. Once a year, lower clergy were allowed to mock the hierarchy. A monk might dress as a bishop, choir boys might deliver silly sermons, and even goats might be led into the sanctuary to receive pretend blessings. It was absurd, but it was also a release. Then came Brother Roland. A man with a gift for pushing things too far, Roland believed that if he was going to be a fool, he would be the greatest fool the church had ever seen. So, on the next Feast of Fools, he didn't just don a bishop's robe, He stole the real one. He didn't just swing the incense burner. He filled it with sausages. And when it came time to bless the congregation, he did so with such greasy enthusiasm that one witness claimed the smell could drive a sinner back to sin. Laughter filled the cathedral. Wine flowed like water. Someone attempted to juggle communion wafers. For a brief and wild hour, the cathedral became a comedy stage, and Brother Roland its shining star. And then the real bishop walked in. He stood at the back of the church, silent, watching, unblinking. As Roland waved smoked meat over his bewildered congregation, the bishop's expression didn't change. But those present would later say it was the kind of stare that could curdle milk and freeze laughter mid-breath. The next day, the clergy held an emergency council. They concluded with great solemnity that the Feast of Fools had gone too far. It was no longer holy satire. It was blasphemy, a mockery of God's house, and so it was abolished. In some regions, even participating in one became grounds for excommunication. The cathedrals returned to solemnity. Jokes were silenced, laughter was considered suspect, and Brother Roland, stripped of both costume and dignity, was sent to a remote mountain monastery, where the silence was thick, the snow was deep, and the only feast was whatever could survive the frost. The Feast of Fools never returned, and so, because one man thought the Eucharist could use more pork, joy itself was banished from the altar. In the courts of kings, where power stood cloaked in gold and danger wore a smile, there was one man whose entire job was to mock it all, the jester. He could speak truths others dared not whisper, so long as he wrapped them in laughter. But even in such a role, there were limits. And Roland le Fool, jester to King Henry I of England, found those limits the hard way. Roland was clever, sharp-tongued, a master of timing and tone. He had kept the court entertained for years with witty observations, harmless jabs, and antics that made even the stiffest noblemen chuckle into their goblets. But wit is like fire, useful when controlled, destructive when loosed without thought. The king, though fond of humor, had two insecurities that everyone knew to avoid: his authority and his boldness. One night, after a long feast filled with wine and storytelling, Roland grew bold. Too bold. He stepped forward in front of the assembled guests, bowed deeply, and launched into a short tale. "Last night," he began, "I dreamed of a crown, shining, golden, resting on your Majesty's noble head." The court chuckled softly. Encouraged, Roland added, "Though perhaps it was simply the reflection off your scalp." Silence followed. Not a gasp, not a breath. Just the sound of danger tightening around him like a noose. The king's smile disappeared. By morning, Roland had been arrested. The charge: mocking the dignity of the crown. The punishment: his tongue was removed, an act as symbolic as it was cruel. The court jester who once filled the halls with laughter was left voiceless. But the consequences didn't stop there. Henry, humiliated, issued a royal decree forbidding any jokes made at the monarchy's expense. From that day forward, jesters were stripped of their edge. They juggled fruit, they tripped over their own feet, but they never, ever mocked the crown. The golden age of medieval satire ended not with a laugh, but with a mutilated silence. And so, because one man aimed his joke a little too high, the court of England learned that in matters of power, even humor must bow. In a time when laws were uncertain and justice was often delivered with the edge of a sword, there existed a method both brutal and divine: trial by combat. Two men entered the field, each claiming to hold the truth. Their fate, it was believed, would be decided by heaven itself. If you were right, God would let you live. If not, your blood would answer for the lie. It was a system built on belief and fear. In the year 1386, that system faced its most famous and final test. Jean de Carouge, A Norman knight of unyielding pride accused Jacques Le Gris, a courtier of charm and cunning, of a crime too grave to ignore, the assault of Carroge's wife, Marguerite. She named Le Gris as her attacker. He denied it with equal passion. The courts, unsure, stalled. Testimony clashed, witnesses contradicted. The king, weary of delay, declared that if man's justice could not decide, then God must. A duel was called. It would be the last sanctioned trial by combat in France. On a cold December day, thousands gathered in Paris. Nobles, priests, and commoners alike crowded into the arena. Marguerite sat high in the stands, her fate bound to the outcome. If her husband lost, it would be taken as proof she had lied, and she would be burned alive. The knights entered the field clad in armor so heavy it bent the earth beneath them. Trumpets blared, prayers rose, and then the fighting began. Steel clashed, blood was spilled. The two men battered one another with such fury that even seasoned warriors turned pale. Le Gris fought with speed and ferocity, Carroge's with brute force and desperate rage. After a savage exchange, Carroge's managed to throw his opponent to the ground. He drove his dagger through Le Gris's throat. The crowd erupted. Marguerite wept with relief. And for that moment, the system had spoken. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But as the years passed, questions lingered. What if Le Gris had told the truth? What if God did not intervene in such matters? The king, troubled by the implications, quietly abolished trial by combat. No longer would guilt or innocence be decided by strength. The sword, for all its glory, was declared unfit to weigh truth. Instead, courts turned to investigation, testimony, and law. Slow, flawed, but more human. The age of divine duels ended that day. Carroge's was hailed as a hero, but history remembered the deeper lesson, that justice found through violence leaves only questions in its wake. In medieval cities where the scent of incense mingled with the stench of refuse, there was one place that promised relief: the public bathhouse, a haven of steam and social gathering where merchants, travelers, and entire families came to scrub away the grime of daily life. It was warm, communal, and, by medieval standards, nearly hygienic. Men and women bathed together, separated only by modesty and a few wooden partitions. Buckets were shared. Conversations echoed off wet walls. It was not just about cleanliness. It was a moment of peace, of ritual, and of rare comfort in a difficult world, until Lord Alaric of Burgundy ruined it. Alaric was a nobleman of wealth, mischief, and an overwhelming fondness for spectacle. One summer night, bored and looking to amuse himself, he entered the local bathhouse not with humility, but with a procession. Several women followed him, not his wife, not anyone's wife in particular, but a collection of courtesans chosen for the evening's entertainment. Perfumed, laughing, and scandalously dressed, they turned the humble bathhouse into something far more decadent. Steam filled the air. So did laughter. So did outrage. Unfortunately for Lord Alaric, among the bathers that night was a servant of the local bishop. He had come for a simple wash. What he witnessed instead sent him fleeing through the streets, robe flapping, mouth open in horror. The church responded with swift fire. Sermons denounced the mingling of bodies. Priests warned of temptations rising with the steam. Alaric was summoned, fined, and excommunicated. But the real punishment was reserved for the bathhouses. They were shut down. Mixed bathing was banned. The spaces that had once echoed with friendly chatter grew silent. In some towns, men and women were ordered to bathe on separate days, or not at all. The fear spread faster than disease. Soon, even water itself became suspicious. Religious leaders warned that warm baths opened the pores of the soul, making it vulnerable to sin. Cleanliness, once celebrated, was now considered dangerous. And so, because one nobleman turned a quiet soak into a scandalous affair, an entire continent stepped away from water. Europe would live in filth for centuries, not because it had no access to baths, but because it feared what might happen in them. The bathhouse did not vanish overnight, but it never recovered its innocence. What had once been a sanctuary of soap and steam became, in the eyes of many, a gateway to sin. In medieval London, bread was more than food. It was survival, a staple in the homes of rich and poor alike. It filled bellies when little else could. For many, bread was the line between hunger and hope. But as with all things essential, it didn't take long for someone to try cutting corners. That someone was Thomas the baker. In the year 1327, flour prices soared. The harvest had been poor, and merchants were tightening their supplies. Thomas, a baker in one of London's busier districts, found himself facing higher costs and shrinking profit. But instead of raising prices or shrinking his loaves, he did something far worse. He added stones. Not large boulders, of course, just enough gravel and small rocks to weigh down each loaf, enough to fool the scales. The outside of the bread looked golden, crusty, and warm. But inside, hidden within the crumb, lurked disaster for anyone with teeth. One merchant took a bite and cracked a molar so loudly that a nearby city official heard it from across the square. Word spread quickly. Dozens came forward, waving suspicious loaves. Some showed bruised gums and broken teeth. Others brought bread that thudded like bricks when dropped. Thomas was dragged before the city's magistrates. The evidence, heavy, suspiciously dense loaves, spoke for itself. Medieval justice was rarely subtle. And while his crime wasn't quite worthy of the gallows, it was still considered an insult to the public trust. The sentence: a public humiliation fitting the offense. Thomas was tied to a post in the market square. A fake loaf was strapped to his head, and he was pelted with real bread, his own crooked creations hurled by angry townsfolk. Children laughed, merchants cheered. Somewhere, a toothless man likely found the whole scene poetic. But something good did come from the incident. To prevent future fraud, the city council passed a new law. Bakers would now be required to add one extra loaf to every dozen sold, not as a reward, but as insurance. If a baker tried to cheat, the buyer still received more than they paid for. That law spread across England and eventually became a tradition. The baker's dozen was born, 13 loaves instead of 12. It was, in essence, a legacy of dishonesty. One man's greed had led to one of the most generous customs in commerce. And though Thomas faded into obscurity, the world remembered his mistake every time someone received an extra roll with their order. So the next time your baker gives you a little more than expected, remember it wasn't always generosity. Sometimes history just doesn't trust the bread. Church music, for much of the Middle Ages, wasn't what you'd call inspiring. It was solemn, predictable, a slow chant that dragged across stone walls like the echo of sleep. Melody was rare, and harmony, well, harmony was practically heresy. Then came Brother Antonius. He was a monk from Burgundy, with a mind that wandered and ears that longed for beauty. Day after day, he joined his fellow brothers in the same chants they had recited for generations. Simple, one-note hymns repeated without variation. It was spiritual, yes, but also dull. And Antonius, for all his piety, found himself yearning for something more. One night, during evening prayers, he decided to take a risk. As the others droned out a familiar chant, Antonius added a second note. Just one, slightly higher, gently woven above the main melody. A harmony. It was soft, brief, barely noticeable to anyone unfamiliar. But to the monks beside him, it was like a lightning bolt had cracked the ceiling. Heads turned, a candle dropped. One brother gasped so loudly it broke the rhythm. The abbot, startled, demanded silence. But Antonius had tasted it, something new, something radiant. The next evening, he did it again. 2 voices this time, then 3. Within a week, half the choir had joined him, experimenting cautiously with notes that had never before dared to echo through their chapel. For a brief, thrilling moment, the monastery came alive with sound. But beauty in those days was often mistaken for rebellion. Word reached the bishop. He came swiftly, robes billowing, his expression carved from centuries of disapproval. After a single performance, he declared the harmonies unnatural, distracting, and sinful. He accused Antonius of bringing worldly pleasure into sacred space, and with one decree, it was over. Harmony was banned. Polyphony, as it came to be known, was cast out from holy music in many monasteries. Simplicity was declared divine. Emotion, suspect. Beauty, dangerous. Antonius was reassigned to a silent order, a monastery so devoted to stillness that even footsteps were muffled. For a man who heard music in his soul, it was a sentence of quiet exile. Centuries later, music historians would look back and recognize what he had done. He had, unknowingly, helped begin the transformation of Western music, from plain chant to rich choral expression. But in his own time, he was simply the monk who dared to sing more than one note. And for that, they silenced him. In the early 13th century, medieval London was a city made of timber, straw, and wishful thinking. Buildings leaned into narrow streets. Thatched roofs kissed each other across alleys, and open flames lit every hearth, forge, and shop. It was beautiful. It was bustling. It was also a fire waiting to happen. And in the summer of 1212 it did, because of a boy named Geoffrey. Geoffrey was an apprentice blacksmith, young, eager, and utterly incapable of following simple instructions. His master had warned him time and again, never leave the forge burning unattended. Fire, after all, was not a pet. It was a predator. But Geoffrey, as apprentices often do, decided he knew better. One evening, as the sun sank behind the wooden rooftops, Geoffrey stoked the forge, shaped a few irons, then felt a growl in his stomach. Dinner called. And so he left. No water pail, no watch. Just an open flame and a room full of dry tools and timber. By the time he returned, it was too late. The fire had spread. First through his workshop, then to the neighboring tavern, then to the warehouses along the river. The air filled with smoke. The sky turned orange, and the flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop like dancers in a mad procession. The heat was so intense, it melted the lead roof of St. Mary's Church. Molten metal poured down the cobbled streets like glowing syrup. Panicked Londoners grabbed what they could and fled, but many didn't escape in time. In total, over 3,000 homes were destroyed. Dozens died. The smell of ash hung in the air for weeks. The Lord Mayor, shaken and furious, issued a decree. From that day forward, no fires were to be lit after sundown, not candles, not lanterns, not hearths. Curfew fell not because of crime, but because of flame. Tavern owners howled in protest, bakers rioted, thieves, delighted by the darkness, flourished, but the law stood. Firelight was forbidden after dark. London became a city of early nights, moonlit walks, and stubbed toes. As for Geoffrey, he vanished from the records. Perhaps he fled. Perhaps the fire took him, too. Or perhaps, some say, he lived on as a cautionary tale whispered to every new apprentice who dared to reach for the bellows without a bucket nearby. And so, one hungry boy's mistake became the foundation for London's first fire safety law, a curfew not born of war or tyranny, but of embers left to burn. In most cultures, funerals are sacred, a time for reflection, mourning, and reverence. But in 1241, at the funeral of Duke Raymond of Toulouse, grief took a back seat to glory, and one man's idea turned solemn ceremony into chaos. The Duke had been a powerful figure, respected across France. When he died, nobles from all over the region arrived to pay their respects. Robes were polished, swords were gleaming, the church was filled with incense and tension. But while others came to honor the dead, one knight saw something else: a stage. Sir Aldrich de Vienne was a man best known for enthusiasm, unbalanced by judgment. As he stood among the mourners, he turned to a companion and said, "Wouldn't the Duke have loved one last joust?" The friend, not nearly cautious enough, agreed. And so, armor was fetched, lances were prepared, horses were saddled. In the middle of the funeral procession, the joust began as a quiet tribute, a tilt in honor of the fallen. But grief is not a stable foundation for combat. One knight's horse stumbled, another missed his mark and impaled a church banner. A young squire tripped over the rope holding the casket steady, and when the coffin itself tipped forward, spilling the late Duke Raymond from his final resting place mid-charge, whatever dignity remained was shattered. Panic swept the crowd. Gasps turned into cries. The abbot nearly collapsed. One monk was reportedly flung into a basin of holy water. It was, as chroniclers wrote, the most disgraceful funeral ever recorded. The next day, the clergy convened in righteous fury. A decree was passed. No tournaments, no games, no feats of arms were to take place near the dead. Funerals were to be silent and sacred. The ruling was swift and widely accepted. Even the rowdiest knights knew they had gone too far. Duke Raymond was eventually reburied with the dignity he deserved, but his funeral became infamous, remembered not for the man, but for the moment he was accidentally launched across the altar. From that day forward, swords were sheathed at gravesides. And the memory of Sir Aldrich's impromptu tournament served as a warning that sometimes honoring the dead means simply standing still. In medieval Europe, a feast wasn't just a meal. It was an event, a celebration of abundance in a world where famine was always near. Nobles gathered in echoing halls filled with torches, roasted meats, rivers of wine and music loud enough to shake the rafters. It was joy in edible form. But like all things unchecked, joy can become chaos, and one man ensured that chaos would bring the whole tradition down. His name was Sir Baldwin of Burgundy. Baldwin had a reputation, not for valor or wisdom, but for drinking. He saw alcohol as a friend, food as fuel, and table manners as optional. During the Feast of St. Martin, a holiday that started holy and ended hedonistic, Baldwin arrived late. Already drunk, armor gleaming, smile crooked. He downed 3 goblets of wine before sitting, then another to catch up, one more for the saint, then a few for symmetry. By the time the main course arrived, Baldwin was swaying. A magnificent roast chicken was placed before the Duke at the head of the table, its skin golden, stuffed with herbs, surrounded by fruit and garnished with edible flowers. It was meant to be admired, carved ceremonially, and then shared. Baldwin saw it as fate. He lunged across the table, grunting, armored elbow, knocking aside goblets. But another knight, sober and equally hungry, reached for the same dish. A tug of war over poultry began. Words turned to shouts, then came fists, then blades. Within moments, chairs were overturned. Trays clattered. One poor minstrel took a flagon to the head. The priest dove under the table clutching a pie, and the roast chicken, the cause of it all, was torn apart mid-air, bones flying like arrows. By dawn, 3 men were dead, 12 injured, and the Duke's grand hall resembled a battlefield rather than a banquet. The church responded immediately. Public feasting was declared dangerous, a breeding ground for gluttony, pride, and violence. Laws were passed. Large banquets were banned or strictly regulated. In their place came smaller, quieter dinners under clerical supervision. Wine was rationed, meat was moderated. Celebration was censored. Sir Baldwin survived, though barely. He woke 2 days later, bruised and confused, asking whether he had won. He hadn't, but he had made history. The noble tradition of medieval feasting, once a symbol of unity, was undone by one man's thirst, a shared chicken, and a spectacular lack of self-control. In the 14th century, the University of Paris was the jewel of European scholarship, a place where minds met to debate theology, ponder philosophy, and occasionally light something on fire. Within its ancient halls, students learned the sacred languages, dissected Aristotle, and asked difficult questions, most of which had safe, approved answers. But one student wanted more. His name was Etienne of Rouen. Etienne was bright, impatient, and dangerously curious. While others were content memorizing texts and arguing about angels, he longed for proof. Not theory, not metaphor, power. And in his mind, if the heavens held answers, then the shadows might hold them too. He began boasting to fellow students that he could summon a spirit, not metaphorically, literally. His classmates laughed. Some encouraged him, the way friends do when they want to see disaster unfold from a safe distance. And so, one damp night, Etienne descended into the basement of the dormitory, a place more suited for storing wine than flirting with the supernatural. He brought with him a candle, a few scraps of bone, a grimoire borrowed from a Dominican friar, who probably shouldn't have owned it himself, and the kind of overconfidence only young men possess. He began the ritual, chanting strange syllables, surrounded by chalk symbols and the smell of burnt parchment. At first, nothing happened. Then the air grew cold. The flame flickered. A low growl began beneath the floorboards. Accounts vary. Some say a demon appeared. Others say it was a furious cat. One witness claimed it was both. Whatever it was, Etienne panicked, tripped, and knocked over the lamp. The basement went up in flames. 2 floors collapsed, the library filled with smoke. Students screamed. Professors wept. The university's west wing burned for 2 days. When the fire finally died, Etienne was found in the ruins, singed but alive, clutching the half-burned book and muttering, "It almost worked." The university responded with fury and fear. The rector banned all study of the occult. No astrology, no alchemy, no books involving sigils, summonings, or suspicious symbols. Other institutions quickly followed suit. Magic, once discussed in whispers, was now officially forbidden. Etienne was expelled, excommunicated. Some say he wandered from village to village afterward, offering to make people invisible, though in truth he may have just been hiding from creditors. But his legacy lingered. He didn't just get himself kicked out, he made entire disciplines illegal. He transformed curiosity into caution. And for centuries after, European scholars stuck firmly to safe subjects, philosophy, scripture, and anything that didn't burst into flames. All because one student tried to cheat on his exam, with a demon as his tutor. In medieval England, humor could be deadly. Jesters were allowed to jest, so long as their jokes knew where to stop. Bards could sing and tease, so long as the target wasn't wearing a crown. But one man, Thomas of Norwich, either didn't know the rules or didn't care. And with one song, he silenced satire across a kingdom. Thomas was a bard of modest fame and immodest wit. He traveled from town to town, lute in hand, tongue sharpened by years of innkeeping and eavesdropping. His songs poked fun at monks who drank too much, nobles who danced too little, and peasants who dreamed too big. He was clever, charming, and bold. In 1314, Thomas received an invitation, or perhaps a summons, to perform at the court of King Edward II. It was an honor and a trap. The king was not in a good place. He had recently suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn. His military reputation was in ruins. His court was tense. His enemies were many, and his patience thin. So naturally, Thomas chose that moment to unveil his latest composition, the Ballad of the Cowardly King. It was brilliantly written. Verses with razor-edged rhyme, choruses that mocked royal missteps with lyrical precision. The court laughed at first. Then the laughter slowed, then stopped, because Edward wasn't laughing. He stared at Thomas as though trying to decide whether the bard was still human or already dead. Then, in a calm voice, he ordered the man arrested. Thomas was dragged from the hall mid-verse. The next morning, a new law was issued. No song, rhyme, or public utterance was to insult or belittle the crown. Not directly, not in metaphor, not even in jest. It was the medieval equivalent of deleting the kingdom's comment section. Minstrels across the realm panicked. Some rewrote their ballads into praises. Others fled to Scotland, where mocking English kings was practically a national pastime. Thomas was not executed, which surprised many. Instead, he was exiled, banned from performing in any royal court, reduced to taverns and marketplaces. He spent his remaining years singing of wine, heartbreak, and fictional kings who definitely weren't Edward II. But his song had done more than offend. It had changed the rules. From that moment on, laughter at the expense of power became dangerous. Satire, once a vital part of public discourse, was filed under sedition. Because one bard dared to tell a joke the king couldn't bear to hear, England learned that sometimes the deadliest weapon in the room isn't a sword. It's a punchline. In most of ancient Greece, women were expected to be quiet, modest, and invisible. Their purpose was simple: marry, bear children, and remain indoors. Athenian philosophers praised silence as a woman's highest virtue. But in one city-state, the rules were not only different, they were inverted. That city was Sparta, and Spartan girls didn't walk in the shadows. They ran, jumped, wrestled, shouted, and they were feared. Unlike their Athenian cousins, Spartan women were raised almost like soldiers. From childhood, they were taught to exercise daily, build strength, and speak with boldness. While boys trained for war, girls trained for motherhood, not just biologically, but ideologically. A weak child, after all, came from a weak mother. So Spartan girls threw javelins, raced barefoot through dusty fields, sang war songs in public festivals, and when boys faltered during their training, it was often the girls who mocked them back into shape. One visiting Athenian, shocked by the sight of women running races and showing bare limbs in public, asked a Spartan why their daughters behaved like men. The reply: so they may bear strong sons. It wasn't just about health, it was about philosophy. Sparta believed that strength was not the domain of men alone. A city could not survive if half its population was weak. And so, Spartan women were educated. They owned land. They managed estates while their husbands were at war. They could speak in court, refuse marriage proposals, and, when necessary, criticize kings. The result? Foreigners found them terrifying. To the rest of Greece, a bold woman was a scandal. In Sparta, she was expected. Spartan girls composed their own songs, often laced with biting remarks aimed at their male counterparts. At festivals, they sang them aloud in chorus. If a boy was known to be lazy or cowardly, his name might appear in the next verse. This wasn't mischief. It was social pressure, enforced by the voices of girls unafraid to speak. Of course, it wasn't equality in the modern sense. Spartan women were still expected to marry, bear sons, and serve the state. But they were not submissive. They were not silent, and they were not weak. When Sparta fell centuries later, historians looked back and marveled, not just at its warriors, but at its women. For in a world that tried to hide its daughters, Sparta raised them in the sun, taught them to fight, and let them speak. And in doing so, they created a generation of women who could shape a city with nothing but their presence and, if needed, their fists. In the ancient world, few symbols were more tightly drawn than the roles of queens. They were meant to sit, advise quietly, and bear heirs. But Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe shattered that mold with a fury that scorched an empire. Her rebellion would begin not with a crown, but with a hairpin. The Romans had arrived in Britain under a banner of civilization: roads, baths, taxes, and steel. At first, they allowed local rulers to maintain some semblance of power as long as they bowed politely and paid regularly. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, did just that. But when he died, Rome broke its promises. His lands were seized, his people brutalized, and worst of all, his wife, Boudica, was flogged. Her daughters were assaulted. The message was clear: submission or ruin. But Boudica didn't submit. She rose from the ashes of that humiliation and gathered her people. She wasn't a queen draped in silk, weeping behind palace walls. She was a storm in human form. Her hair, it was said, flowed down to her hips. Her eyes flashed with fury, and in her hand she held not just a spear, but the hairpin used to fasten her daughter's hair. It had been torn out during the assault. She kept it as a reminder. She rode out on a chariot, her daughters beside her, and delivered speeches that would shake warriors into action. Her words were not polished. They were fire. They struck first at Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, a Roman town of arrogance and fragile walls. It fell in hours. Next came Londinium, then Verulamium. Roman settlements burned, statues toppled, the legions, caught off guard, retreated. Tens of thousands died. Boudica, it seemed, was unstoppable. But empires do not fall easily. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped. He chose the battlefield carefully. Narrow terrain, controlled space, and when the two armies met, the outcome turned not on rage, but on tactics. The Iceni, brave and wild, were cut down. Their chariots couldn't maneuver. Their numbers, once an advantage, became a bottleneck. Boudica watched her army die. Some say she took poison rather than be captured. Others say she vanished into legend. But her uprising changed everything. The Romans rebuilt, but they ruled more carefully, more cautiously. They knew now what a queen could become when pressed. Boudica became a symbol not of royalty, but resistance, and the hairpin, once a tool of vanity, became a weapon of memory. In the 10th century, the papacy was a mess. Popes were appointed, deposed, imprisoned, and occasionally murdered, often all in the same decade. Rome was no longer the city of saints. It was the city of schemers. And in the middle of this chaos, a man named John of Benevento decided he was destined to wear the tiara.
The only problem, John wasn't a cardinal or a bishop or even a priest. He was a peasant, a farmer's son who had once worked in the kitchens of a local monastery. But John was also clever, well-spoken, and very good at reading people. He knew the church was fragmented. He knew the nobles were fighting. And most of all, he knew how to lie. He began by calling himself Brother Johannes, a simple monk on pilgrimage. He made friends among traveling clergy, listened to gossip, and repeated it with additions that made him seem wise. He told tales of visions, of divine signs, of relics found in dreams. And when he reached Rome, he claimed he had been sent by God to heal the chaos of Peter's throne. Incredibly, some believed him. A faction of Roman nobles, desperate for a puppet pope they could control, saw in John a perfect vessel. They dressed him in robes, gave him a Latin name, and pushed him forward as Pope Constantine III. For almost 3 weeks he ruled. He issued blessings, held court, even signed a decree condemning corruption, though he had no idea what it said since he couldn't read. But power draws scrutiny. One morning, a visiting bishop challenged him in public, asking him to recite a verse from the Gospels. John stalled, fumbled, then tried to change the subject by blessing a pigeon that had landed nearby. It didn't work. The fraud unraveled quickly. John was dragged from the Lateran palace, beaten by guards, and imprisoned. The church, humiliated, launched a purge. Dozens were arrested. Reforms were promised. And from that moment on, rules around papal elections grew stricter, cardinals only, with records, oaths, and witnesses. John of Benevento faded into legend. Some said he repented and lived quietly as a monk. Others claimed he escaped and became a traveling preacher. But one thing was certain. For a few days, a farmer's son held the throne of St. Peter, not through force, not through miracles, but through ambition, timing, and a talent for pretending. In the quiet stone halls of a monastery near Cologne, a man named Brother Anselm spent his life surrounded by silence, scripture, and the ticking of water clocks. Most monks copied texts or tended gardens. Anselm did something far stranger. He asked questions no one else dared to ask. Questions like, what is the shape of grief? How heavy is regret? How long does sorrow last? He wasn't trying to challenge doctrine. He simply wanted to understand why people suffered, not just physically, but in the mind. Why did one monk, struck by tragedy, withdraw into himself, while another sang louder at vespers? Why did guilt linger in some and vanish in others? Anselm began recording his observations. He watched his fellow monks over months, even years. He noted how often they prayed, whether they wept, how they walked, what dreams they spoke of during confession. He wasn't judging, he was measuring. He invented a system of tallies, symbols, and crude charts. It was primitive but astonishing. He called it mentura animi, the measurement of the soul. His goal wasn't to question faith, but to quantify pain, to track joy, to understand the soul not just as a divine spark, but as a thing that behaved in patterns. Then he made a mistake. He shared his findings with a visiting bishop. The bishop was horrified. He accused Anselm of reducing the immortal soul to mathematics, of stripping mystery from the divine. Within days, Anselm was summoned before an ecclesiastical court. They declared his work dangerous, unorthodox, a gateway to heresy. He was forbidden to write further. His manuscripts were seized, and he was reassigned to a remote mountain chapel where the only soul he could measure was his own. But his writings were not destroyed. A young monk had copied them, quietly, secretly, and decades later those notes found their way into the hands of scholars in Paris. Centuries after that, historians would uncover them again and realize what Anselm had stumbled upon. He wasn't a heretic. He was the first to treat human thought and feeling as a science. Today, we call it psychology. He didn't use the term, he didn't know the theories, but he tried to measure sadness, to chart guilt, to understand fear. And because of that, he was silenced, but not forgotten. History, we're often told, is shaped by great men, by emperors, generals, prophets, and kings. It's carved in stone and etched in gold, recorded in books written by scholars who choose what deserves remembrance and what must fade into silence. But when you look closer, when you step beyond the portraits and the palaces, you begin to see something far stranger and far more honest. History is also shaped by jesters who speak one joke too many, by bakers who stuff rocks into bread, by monks who dare to ask forbidden questions, by queens who rise not with armies but with symbols as small as a hairpin, by students, lovers, fools, and fire starters, people who never intended to change the world but did. These people didn't make grand speeches. They didn't lead crusades. Most of them weren't even remembered by name. But what they did, often by accident, defiance, or desperation, sent shockwaves that outlived them by centuries. A misstep becomes a law. A scandal becomes a reform. A poorly timed joke rewrites what's safe to say. And a single riot over a roast chicken ends the golden age of feasting. They are footnotes in textbooks if they're mentioned at all. And yet, their impact is real, etched not into marble, but into the way we live, speak, celebrate, and mourn. This is the quiet truth no empire wants to admit, that power is fragile, that tradition is brittle, that all it takes is one unexpected person doing one unexpected thing at one unexpected time for everything to change. And perhaps that is why these stories linger. Not because they are strange, though they are. Not because they are funny or tragic, though they are that too. But because they remind us that the past was never predictable. It was never safe. It was never just a march of kings and conquests. It was chaotic. It was human. It was ours. So the next time you feel small, insignificant against the tide of history, remember this. Amongst him, a bard's insult, a noble's drunken mistake, these were not the acts of titans. They were moments, tiny sparks, and yet they lit fires that reshaped the world. History isn't only what was planned. It's also what went wildly, gloriously wrong. And that is what makes it worth remembering.